Hello, everyone. I'll just let everybody come into the Zoom room. Give it just a few moments. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Politics and Prose Live. My name is Beth Wong. I'm an event manager at PNP, and we thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon to celebrate Dark Tides by Philippa Gregory. At any time during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase additional copies of this afternoon's book on Politics and Prose's website. We know that everybody bought a book to attend the event today, but just want to underscore that your purchases are coming to the store at an incredibly difficult time for small businesses across the country, especially small independent bookstores. And in addition to growing your own library, a book sale from Politics and Prose today means that we at the store are able to keep bringing you content like this. We're able to stay open in the midst of a pandemic, and we're able to bring the holiday spirit to all of you in your gift giving this winter. You can ask our author a question tonight by submitting it to the Q&A box, which is below. The button is in the chat near your screen. Be sure to submit your question there and not in the chat to make sure our author sees it. I will now pass on any introduction duties to my colleague, Scott Patrick, a bookseller at Politics and Prose. Scott, are you able to give the intro of Philippa and Angela?
Sure. I do have an intro prepared for Philippa. However, because of the lead edition of the moderator, please forgive me, my internet connection appears to be unstable.
Oh, that's okay.
But Philippa Gregory, of course, is a wonderful historical novelist. She's best known for The Other Boleyn Girl, published in 2001. And of course has been adapted into, I believe, two separate feature films. She's been called the queen of historical fiction, and I'm personally a big fan of hers as well. Angela, would you like to introduce yourself maybe? I'm sorry I didn't have time to prepare for something.
No, absolutely. So hello, everyone. I'm Angela. I am a full-time health editor based in Washington. And outside of that, I spend all my time freelancing. And my favorite thing is to write about books and wonderful authors like Philippa. So you've likely seen my books pieces in the Washington Post book world and elsewhere. And I'm super excited to be here joining Philippa on conversation tonight. So thanks for having me. We're in for a great chat.
Thank you so much. And now, without further ado, Philippa Gregory with Angela Haupt, Dark Tides.
Well, hello, and Philippa, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on this new book, Dark Tides. I have to tell you, I read it in one night because it is just so wonderful to get lost in. So congratulations on this latest release. So
thank you so much. I appreciate it.
So before we dive into talking about Dark Tides, set the scene for us. Where are you right now? And I know you're joining us not at 4:05 p.m. like those of us in Washington. So set the scene for us, where you are and, what it's like on your side of the world right now.
Okay, it's 9 o'clock. I'm in England. It's very, very dark. We are approaching our darkest point of winter. So it's also, I can reliably report, rainy, cloudy, miserable. But I'm in the countryside where I love to be in my home.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us late at night. I know you have a long night tonight with yet another talk after this. So let's get into it. So Dark Tides begins 21 years after the end of the first book in this series, Tidelands. So I'm curious, tell us what drove that decision? How did you settle on, what amount of time you wanted to pass between the first and the second books?
This has really been a series which is evolving. That when I started it, I knew that I wanted to do the story of a family in history. So I wanted to start with them as most families start, when they can first identify their origins in relative poverty, almost always in the country because there are so few people living in towns then, and in agriculture and supporting themselves in a sort of a survivalist mode, which is how are they going to get to the next generation? And of course, many families never make that step. So all of us who are alive today had ancestors who did manage to make that step. And so the first book was quite easy to time, in that I wanted it to be the story of a family in poverty, struggling for survival, and who, by a number of circumstances, including being right at the heart of the arrest of Charles I in the English Civil War, find themselves at the end of the book leaving their home and arriving in London. What I didn't really foresee was that if I got as attached to the characters as I have done, and as reluctant to leave them as I am, that I wouldn't be able to speed through the centuries very much, because I wanted to stay with my original family. So we're 21 years on, which is, and why we're then is because a character in the first book, my heroine's lover, believes that she has had his child and he needs a son and heir. And so he comes to this very poor warehouse where she is trading as a wharfinger, a woman owning a warehouse with a small trading coastal trade on the River Thames. And he comes there very much in the spirit of a man who is about to rescue our heroine, and very much in the belief, as you know, men both in fiction and in life have, which is that he's going to put everything right, and he's going to find his son, and he's going to leave his son his beautiful house and his stately home. And in that sense, it's a restoration for everybody. We're just in the first years of the restoration of Charles II, of the return of the monarchy to England. And Sir James is part of this return of the Cavaliers to their country houses, to their homes, to their places at court, to their wealth. And he thinks that he is going to restore the woman he loves as well. And what he finds is that she doesn't want him and she doesn't want his money. And she is prepared to take the massive risk of carrying on as a woman in trade in London.
So, as you alluded, something that's really interesting about this book and this series in general is that it is about ordinary people. It's not about those well-known historical figures you often write about. So, tell us about why that was important to you, and why you wanted to write about ordinary people. And also, I'd be curious, as an extension of that, how that shifts the writing process for you to be writing about these more ordinary people.
I think my first work has always been was set in the royal courts, but that wasn't because I was interested in royals actually at all. It was because I was interested in people whose lives I could find records of. And what I wanted to write about was the less known women. So for instance, The Other Boleyn Girl is not about Anne Boleyn, it's about Mary Boleyn, her sister, a less well-known woman, and how she could survived, how she lived her life. But the great advantage of having a woman like that as a heroine is that there are at least some records, not necessarily of her birth, but of her life and ultimately her death. In her old age, we even have her tax returns. So there's material there, which as a historian you can use as research for the fiction. But my interest always was with ordinary women, with working class people in particular, and with women whose stories are not told, because it seems to me the first thing we lose when we lose history is, when we lose the battle, is that we lose the history. So when people say winners write the history, that's absolutely true. The history is only written about winners. So that's always going to be, until very recent times, elite, politically important men whose lives are going to be recorded by other elite men. And it's mainly going to concern their meetings with other elite men, you end up with this kind of very narrow band of recorded history. And I've always been interested in the history beyond that band and the history of the people whose lives are not very well recorded. So it was very natural to want to write a novel set in the lives of working class people, especially working class women. But of course, that poses tremendous difficulties for research.
Well, that actually leads in perfectly to my next question. Your books are so very richly researched. I would love if you could tell everyone about the research that went into this book. And I know, for example, you went to an isolated island. Is that right?
Yes, in the Venice lagoon.
Oh, tell us about that. What kind of, research this book involved and what your trips were like.
Well, all of the research it's people long to know that it's meeting people and talking to them, but the great bedrock of the research is written research. So all of the material about, for instance, trade in London and women in industry and women in shipping, this comes from documents that we have now that comes from the London guilds and the London trades. So there's a lot of research at the heart of the novel, which hopefully the reader never has any real sense of. Ideally, I think in historical fiction, where you're learning very lightly. If you're going to write a good novel, it's got to be very much about the nature of the people. The reader doesn't want to feel is that they've opened a PhD thesis. So I read the PhD thesis, so you don't have to. But then what we come to is the period, which is just such a joy. So I went to Hadley, the village of now city, but then a village of Hadley in New England. And I wanted to look at the early settler life in New England. And I was particularly interested in the Native American nations around Hadley at the time. And that was the Pokanoket people. And I was deeply, genuinely honored to be invited by the current Sagamore of the tribe and the Pometacom to go to their tribal lands, which they don't own, which they are allowed access to. That in itself is probably something that one should consider. And we went to the place where their famous tribal leader, King Philip, the Pometacom, then was killed by the colonial armies. So it was a profoundly moving visit. And I couldn't have written the whole section, which is a very substantial section of the book, about Ned himself, an English settler who finds himself on the margin of English society, and who finds himself so close to the Pokanoket people. I couldn't have written any of that without visiting them and without talking to them, and they were good enough to talk to me about their history, and they were generous enough to say that they wanted me to write their story. It wasn't a question of me going in and feeling that I was taking their story. They wanted their story to be told. And then the other foreign trip that I did for this book, which was magical, was I went to Venice, and I was lucky enough to be determined to go there just after the very bad flood last spring. And so I was in Venice when it was practically deserted. And if you know Venice, it's always so very, very full, and it's always so busy. And I literally stood one end of St. Mark's Square, and there was not a person between me and the cathedral the other end. It was extraordinary. And part of the trip was indeed to go to one of the quarantine islands and visit the old quarantine hospital there, which is now a museum. And we were out of season, but the curator was kind enough to open the doors and to show me around this extraordinary 17th century building.
Wow, that's wonderful. Now, have you always been a person so deeply interested in history? Has that been a part of you, your whole life?
In the sense that I was always interested in the stories my mother used to tell me. And my mother was a great fictionalizer of history, I must say, almost all my family stories are completely untrue as far as I can make out. However, I didn't enjoy history at school because it was taught then in those days in a way very, very guaranteed to put off anyone from historical inquiry. It was really very, very dull. I was at my pre-college stage at school. We did a course on the wars of the Emperor Justinian. And I have to tell you, there is nothing more boring to a teenage girl than the accounts of the wars of the Emperor Justinian. I mean, if you said what we want to do now is to put people off studying history, you couldn't go in a more direct and successful way to do it. But when I went to university, and I went after I had qualified as a journalist, so I went relatively late in life at about 21. I went to study English literature because I always loved reading. I was an avid reader from a very young age. And I just fell in love with the study of history there. I had an incredibly inspiring and insightful tutor. And I realized then that I just wanted to study history as my life's work. I didn't want to do anything else. I just wanted to read history. So I went from, that was Sussex University. I went from Sussex University to Edinburgh, where I studied for my PhD. And in the last year of writing my PhD thesis, I wrote my first historical novel, and that was sold worldwide incredibly successfully. And I realized then that the way I was going to study history was not as I had thought at a university, but actually in this way, by research and writing historical fiction. And in so doing, I've probably reached far more potential historians and had far more people as a result of my work study history themselves than any other way I could have imagined. It's been a great career.
Yes, I see on, Goodreads and other spots like that, how many people talk about the profound impact you've had on their life because you've opened up their eyes, and taught them so many new things and introduced them to things they didn't really realize that, they were interested in. But I'm curious, your trip to Venice sounds so wonderful. Do you have a favorite research trip or a favorite memory from all of these, interesting things you've gotten to do over the years?
I mean, I think each one is, you have a moment of extraordinary vision. I think the one at Venice, which was so striking, was that usually I've been to Venice several times, and of course, what you're interested in is the beautiful canals and the wonderful buildings and the art collections and the music. There's always music everywhere. I always go and listen to something when I'm at Venice. But on this trip, because I was interested in the quarantine island and because part of the book is set there, I took a ferry right into the heart of the lagoon, past the usual islands that you go in Venice, past the glassmakers, past Murano, out into the lagoon. And I realized when I was walking around the outside of the castle walls are on the perimeter of the island because it was a fortified island. And as I walked on the outside of the walls, I realized that the landscape, the lagoon, was very, very much how I had described the coastal landscape in Tidelands, my first novel. And so my hero, who is imprisoned on the island for a period of time, has this sense of homecoming, and that in a way so much of coastal and tidal estuary life and coastal and tidal estuary geography and the look of the place and the feel of the place, this marginal liminal place which is between sea and land, that runs through the novels. And there it was. I saw it again in Venice as I had seen it in Sussex.
Wow, oh, that's wonderful. Now, shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about writing a female villain. Livia, in your book, for example, is a typical female villain, but with a backstory that makes you, want her to succeed. Can you talk to us about the complexity of developing a character who everyone loves to hate?
Well, I think she's got to be multi-layered. I don't think it's enough that she should be a villain. In one sense, she has the tropes of female villainy. She is a widow whose husband is in fact not innocently dead, but she has a hand in his disappearance. She's extraordinarily beautiful. She is accompanied everywhere by a beautiful child whom she cheerfully neglects. So there's some traditional tropes here which warn you that you are looking at a female criminal. But also what I was interested with her was actually making her true to herself. So there's a passage in the novel where she says to her female friend, her sister-in-law, she says, I do lie, and I will lie to you, but I never lie to myself. I know what I am. And there's something about that sort of naked ambition which she is prepared to acknowledge in herself, which I think makes her rather endearing to those of us who also have moments when we are ambitious and when we look ourselves in the mirror and go like, I really want this, and I don't see why I shouldn't aspire to it. And in a way, although she's a villain very much in her period because she's aspirational, she's not a villain in our period because we believe that it's reasonable for a woman to want to succeed and for a woman to want to do very well for herself. Why she remains a villain is that she's completely unscrupulous in what she does, and she's incredibly manipulative. But I think that's a joy to write. You know, it's such fun to write somebody who is as bad as you can imagine, and she really is. I mean, she's a cad, and she's a rogue. But I like her so much that at the end of the novel, she actually gets what she wants. We will see whether it brings her lasting joy, but certainly Livia is an example of a woman whose ambition exceeds her conventionality and her gentility, and that's an interesting character to write.
And interesting character to read about as well. Now, when you start a new series, do you already have a sense in your mind of the entire storyline? You know, not only where things will begin, but where things will end, however many books down the line? Or are you simply thinking about, you know, that very first launching pad?
I had a vision of a book that I wanted to get to. So I know that I want to write about a book set in the late 18th century because I want to write about the blue stocking movement, people like Mary Wollstonecraft, and a woman who is actually a 5 times great aunt of mine, Mary Hayes, who was a friend of Mary Wollstonecraft, and we have her letters. So we know quite a lot about her. We know quite a lot about Mary Wollstonecraft and the world that they lived in because the research has been done. Once you get past about 1680, 1700, women start keeping journals. So you genuinely have material to go off and you can have genuine insight into the lives of these historical women. Whereas before then, you're reconstructing their history from when they appear in the records. So I knew I wanted to get to the 18th century because there are women there that I want to write about. And I was very, very sure that I want to get to a financial crash for this family, that they're going to increase in prosperity, as so many families did, through some honourable means and some very, very criminal and nefarious means. So as part of the British Empire, their prosperity will rise. As the historian Hobsbawm says, every family in England got rich on slavery. You can't pick out, well, you can if you want, you can pick out the people who were professional, full-time, determined slavers and see where their fortune came from. But every single family in England had sugar in the bowl at tea time, had tea on the table at tea time. These are imperial products. Everybody's prosperity improved as a result of it. And I think it's so interesting to look at the nation's history through the eyes of an individual family. And that's why it's going to be a saga which is going to go so long, and why it's going to have so much up and down in it. Because what I'm trying to look at is how the big political story is personal.
Oh, I see. Very interesting. Are there time periods that you have not gotten to explore in your books yet that you're still very eager to, you know, to one day shift your attention to?
I think because my original history degree was 1688, where I'm arriving, I'm pleased to say, to 1950, I have a sort of a bird's eye view not nearly enough detail, not nearly enough knowledge, but I have a bird's eye view of the sort of trends that I'm looking at. But so much of the history has not even been written yet. So the history of women in the late 17th, early 18th century, we know very, very little, you know, because women didn't write their own records, because women's history is still a new discipline. There's an awful lot for us to research and learn. And until the basic research is done, the fiction is going to be very speculative. So what's going to be interesting over the next few years for me is to move forward in time towards the 18th century where there's more material, trying to write novels based on really what records there are. And most of the records of working class women in the period that I'm writing about are records of criminal records. The only time the literate people observe working class women is when they're in court. So you get a very skewed view. So the material that you do read, you have to read with immense care. You have to read through the record rather than just trust it.
Now, Dark Tides was chosen as Apple's audiobook of the week this week, which is really neat. And it's read by Louise Brealey. But I was curious, you know, are you involved with that audiobook process at all? You know, is that something where do you meet with the narrator to kind of talk about the book, or what is that process like, you know, the audiobook process on your end?
Usually people ask me about casting, and, you know, we have a conversation about, you know, who would be a great actress. It's almost always a woman, because my narrators are almost always first person female voice. So we usually have a conversation about that, but I do feel very strongly, as with the movies or the television series, that when you move from one medium to another, it behoves you to mind the knitting, we'd say in England. Like, you know, what do I know about? I really know about writing novels. I have served a long, arduous, determined apprenticeship in novel writing. I know how to put a novel together, how to do a really convincing, beautiful audio recording. I like to hand that over to the people who do it.
Good philosophy. Now, tell us about what you are working on now, and also how your writing process has changed this year, given the pandemic and given on these restrictions on going to places where you normally would be going.
Well, I'm missing the travel very much. I mean, so much of the research is book-based and text-based. So these days, you don't have to go to libraries to read, though. I am so old that my PhD, I had to literally drive to the libraries where they had the records that I was consulting. Nowadays, almost so much is digitized. It's such a wealth of research. It's extraordinary. You could find out really to PhD level and beyond about almost anything if you searched hard enough. So the idea of reading is you know, I'm completely liberated. I can do that from home, and I've been doing it from home for the last, I suppose, 5-10 years or so. So my life has not changed at all because of that. And in a sense, if you're a serious professional fiction writer, you're always a bit locked down, because the only way you're going to do any effective work is if you are, as it were, trapped at home in your study on your own. Like, it's not a time where, you know, you should be out partying. It is a time where you need to really think and listen to the silence. So in that sense, lockdown is a bit sort of business as usual. I'm not yet missing my research trips, because they're usually the last stage before writing. So they're the essential last bit where you really combine finding stuff out with the inspiration. And I always find when I go anywhere that I hopefully find out all the things that I knew I wanted to know, but then I find out things I had not even dreamed of. So that's why the trips are such a revelation. You see things that you didn't know were there. And so I'm missing them very much, but that missing will become acute about next spring.
Next spring. Okay. Well, here's hoping that you will be able to resume maybe next spring. So I'm going to hop over. We have an audience question here for you. It is this book based on a real particular family or an imagined sort of composite?
It has a connection to a real particular family, a family that I know that did start in a place called Faraway in poverty and got themselves to a wharf in London. So there is a real family that did that. And actually, it's my family. And I was able to go with my cousin to the very wharf where they had a wharf on the Thames, and that's where I've placed this family's wharf. So there's a connection that far, but of course, because it's such a long time ago, we don't have very much records. We have a few financial records, and we have, I think, one letter. So it's not enough to build a novel on that. The composite nature of it was when I decided that my heroine would be a midwife and a herbalist. And because this is a time when the College of Physicians was trying to establish itself as a men-only, professional-only guild, there's a lot of material about women midwives and women healers at this period of time, mainly critical, mainly the male doctors trying to say that women should not be allowed to practice. And of course, there's all the witch trials, which also take a highly critical view of working class women trying to work in medicine at the time. So there's a lot of material about poor women, but it's all highly critical or criminal. But if you take it and read through it, then what you get is, I think, some very clear indications of the sort of lives that my heroine lived.
Now we have another question from the audience I'd like to ask you, which is, who is your favorite kind of reader? Who do you write for? And who do you most hope that your work reaches?
I don't write for any particular reader, and I often say I have too much to do with these characters who are going all around the world and who are engaged in all sorts of activities, some of which I have planned, others which just emerge in the writing, to worry about the reader at that stage. So I don't tend to think about the reader until I do an event like this and actually meet you. And at that point I go, oh, you like this, do you? But by then it's too late anyway, because the book is published. And I really think that for someone trying to write with any sort of artistic integrity and truth, you can't think about the readership. You can't lift your eyes from the page where you are trying to put down the best quality of writing and the best quality of research that you can muster. Any diversion from that is, I think, fatal. But when I meet readers, the readers that I like are obviously the ones that like the book and tell me that. I like them a lot. I like readers who take the trouble to read through the book and read the layers of it. Equally, if you want to just enjoy it on the sun lounger, you're free to do that. But I have put deliberately a lot of depth into these novels, and it's nice when someone sees that. And I find it really inspiring when someone says to me that the novel inspired them to go to college or to go to university or to study history, or even just to read another book. That my book should open the world of reading and history to any reader is honestly, it's the greatest reward I can imagine.
That's lovely. Do you have favorite go-to history books that you would recommend to somebody who is, whether it's a history book or historical fiction, to somebody who has started with you and wants, wants more?
The difficulty that I have is that I don't myself read anyone else's historical fiction.
Oh, really?
Well, for the very good reason that I cannot risk getting muddled in my own mind between historical fact and someone else's fiction, which would be disastrous. And also because I find when I read anybody, I find their fictional voice, their narrational voice, very easy to catch. And And if you think of somebody like D.H. Lawrence, you think of the style of D.H. Lawrence, you can hardly read a book by D.H. Lawrence and not come out with a sort of exaggerated sensibility for half a day after. You know, your heart is going to be thrilling and you're going to be, you know, full of sensual passion. You just can't read it intensely without an intense reaction. So when I'm writing, I read only history. And when I'm not, and I'm never not writing or researching, and if I give myself a day off, then I tend to read either English classics or light fiction. So if you were saying, if you like a saga, a big book set in the past, I can't think of a better one than George Eliot's Middlemarch. So if you've enjoyed these books, you very well might love George Eliot's Middlemarch, or at any rate try Mill on the Floss, which is smaller but still extraordinarily interesting, about middle class and working class people in the historical past, written by a master of the form.
What has reading meant to you during this very difficult, tumultuous year? You know, have you used books to kind of cope? Has that been something that you've turned to while we all grapple with these conditions?
I launched a book club, which was literally, we read about, I think, half a dozen books before, I have to say, I ran out of steam. But I thought it would be helpful to people who wanted suggestions as to what to read and to read collectively. So we had the Philippa Gregory Lockdown Book Club, which was really good fun. And we read my favorite books. It was completely egotistical. We just read my favorite books and I talked about them. So it was great fun for me, and I think it was good fun for the readers. And in the meantime, I mean, I have just literally carried on reading history. I was ill for a period of time myself, and in that time I read my childhood favourites, Georgette Heir, who is as light and as skillful as a great chef making a souffle. And I've just broken into, for the first time since my teenage years, Agatha Christie. So I'm expanding my reading taste to see how I feel about very, very conventional, very old-fashioned suspense.
Oh, how interesting. That's great. Now, when you're writing, do you have like a writing room in your home where you just kind of close the door and tuck yourself away? Or, you know, what's your writing environment like?
I have a study. Every house I've ever lived in for the last 20 years, I've always had a designated study, because I have a million books. I mean, that's an example. But I have 1,000 books and they all have to be shelved somewhere. And I get a lot of pleasure from owning them. I look at the spines, I have to say, I gloat over them. I have a library and it is one of my treasures. So I have a lot of books and I have a desk where I put my laptop. But having said that, I can write anywhere, and I do write all the time. So when I'm traveling, I take my laptop and I write on planes and trains and waiting for planes and trains. And the modern life we live in, you know, I can take my library with me. It's so extraordinary.
It's amazing. Let's hop over to another audience question now. So Sheila is asking, she says she so liked the main protagonist in Tidelands and was disappointed that she became an invalid in Dark Tides. Did you do this to help transit to the next generation of the family?
I'm thinking how to formulate this answer without creating a spoiler for other readers, but what was the name of the lady who asked the question?
Sheila.
Sheila, remember what happened to her? Cast your mind back, Sheila. At the end of Tidelands, what happened to her was not minor. What happened to her was very, very serious. You don't come out of that experience untouched. I can't say more than that, Sheila, but you know what I mean. And also, we are 21 years on, and I adore her also. Her name is Alinor, my heroine, and she's a wonderful woman. But I'm trying to write a family saga. The fact that she's in 2 books is a really bad sign that we're not getting on through the years. She can't be in another one, Sheila, I'm sorry, but we've really got to get on through the centuries if we're going to get to the 18th century and to 1920. But yes, she is. She's a character that really stayed with me. And I think although she's not in the health and the strength that she was in book 1, you still see her spirit, you still see her extraordinary gifts and her generosity of spirit. And of course, she has a wonderful granddaughter who has her gifts.
Well, I think that's a very satisfying response. Another question here from the audience. Are you a devotee of English historians who have shined a light on common people and their histories? And are there any historians you would recommend who also write from this point of view?
Oh yes, I mean, of course, the English marks at school of English historians changed the way history was written forever, for everybody forever. So almost every accessible popular history book you read now will include a history of working people in a way that just wasn't written before 1900. I mean, round about 1950s when you see this great flowering. So anything by E.P. Thompson is going to be wonderful. George Roudet, Hobsbawm. I mean, there are schools. I suppose from the point of view of women's history, I can't recommend Sheila Rowbottom, Hidden from History, enough. The very title is absolutely iconic, that what she was describing was women's lives that existed in history but had been hidden. So, you know, have a look at the back of my books. I always put a bibliography in, and I always mention the books that were the most helpful to me for that particular book. But some of the classics of English historical writing are absolutely my standby.
Jumping over to another question, somebody is wondering, you co-wrote a book about women in the Wars of the Roses. Any plans to work on any more nonfiction projects that shine a light on women in history?
Oh, well, thank you for that question. That's very dear to my heart. I'm working now on a very long, very complicated non-fiction history, and it's going to go from 1066, when I argue that England is invaded by a patriarchy. So William of Normandy comes in and establishes patrimonial inheritance. So the oldest son gets everything. He establishes patrilineal kingship. So the oldest son becomes king, which excludes women. The Norman law excludes women from not just inheritance, but from legal presence. So immediately you have established in England in 1066 a patriarchy. And the way that patriarchy interacts with capitalism, empire, the expansion of Britain overseas is of enormous importance to women. And that's why I think it's impossible for women to make progress in the society towards equality until we really understand the stages, the ebb and flow of women's rights and women's freedoms as they're established. So it's a huge book. It's going to go 1066 to 1966, so 9 centuries. Nobody writes big histories like that anymore. The last person who wrote it was like, Winston Churchill. Is a history of the English-speaking people. It's a massive book, and it's been incredibly interesting to me to work on. It's really fed into the fictions as well, because obviously I'm looking at working class women in English society. I don't think I'll be finished within a couple of years or so, but when I do, I'll come back and talk to you about it. And I hope very much that it's going to be what I hope it will be, which is a tracing of women's progress and the pushback against it over 9 centuries in England.
Wow, that's so interesting. Now, when did you start that project? How long have you been working on it?
4 or 5 years. I mean, it's of course grown over the time. I knew it was going to be 9 centuries when I started. What I didn't predict was that, for instance, the extraordinary explosion of scholarship in gay and gender fluid studies would mean that there's a whole history there which is now more accessible than it was before, and more relevant and important than people would have regarded it, say, 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, nobody would have talked very much about those studies at all. So it's become more controversial as I've been studying, but at the same time, it's become more important and more interesting. So it's a topic which itself is growing as my report on it is growing. So I'm playing catch up all the time now.
How do you think the historical fiction genre has evolved, or how have perceptions of it evolved during the time that you have been writing historical fiction novels? Have there been shifts or changes that you've noticed?
I'm very proud to say I'm part of the evolution of it. When I wrote my first novel, Wideacre, in the 80s, historical fiction was very much regarded as a sort of genre, a rather lowly genre, and the understanding of it was that it was very akin to historical romance, and it was fundamentally about love stories of people in crinolines. Their history was very little researched, and the love story and the sexual element to it was really prioritized. And I wrote a novel called Wideacre, which was sexually very explicit and quite bold for the time, but which was really had as its heroine a really credible 18th century woman whose ambitions and fears were those of 18th century women. It wasn't a modern woman put in a long dress, living out her life. So it's and at the time people said, you've subverted the genre, which was interesting. But since then, as I have worked in the period, in period fiction, and as other, very serious, very interesting authors have written historical fiction, A.S. Byatt's Possession was probably a big turning point for a lot of people. I think people have seen that you can do in historical fiction, or you can bring to it all of the seriousness that you'd bring to a contemporary novel, and you can bring to it all of the literary seriousness that you could bring to any novel written in any way at all. And I think in general, what used to be called genre fiction has attained a sort of coming of age, partly because of the genuine efforts that authors have made to say, this is serious, my work is serious, it's not trivial, it's not pulp, it's not hack work, it's a serious artistic endeavor. And the fact that I choose to set this novel in a time, or in space, or in a murder, or all the other settings that one can choose, does not of itself make it inferior. And logically, why would it? I mean, there's no logical connection between setting and quality of writing. And I think what's happened over the last 30 years is that people have understood that for all what used to be called genres.
Right. Yes, very true. Now, do you have one character or a few characters who you've written who you feel are most dear to your heart? Or, would that be like picking a favorite child? Are you not able to do that? Or, are there some who you still really think about and who, have left a really deep impression on you?
Yes, of course, there are some that I think will never leave me. Elizabeth Woodville, the wife of Edward IV, who was the White Queen and was the mother of the character who I call the White Princess, Elizabeth of York. I mean, her life is so extraordinarily full of incident, adventure, risk, and rise and fall. It's a wonder to me that nobody took more interest in her before I did. I can't imagine how anybody could have missed her. I mean, she's the mother of the Princess in the Tower, for heaven's sake. And, historians had by and large written her off, partly for that reason, that they couldn't understand her historical actions. And so they decided that they must be irrational. So she's one of the characters that's been such a joy to work on, because I have the sense of rescuing her from wrong and actually slanderous report. And she's also, I mean, she marries for love, and she's extraordinarily beautiful. So, I mean, we know she's extraordinarily beautiful. We've got paintings of her that show she's extraordinarily beautiful. Very well read. She brings the first printer to England to print books. She brings Thomas Caxton to England. I mean, what's not to like? She's the most wonderful character. And I suppose all of the wives of Henry VIII, I think, have been written down rather than written up to the quality of the lives that they lived. But among my great favourites would be Catherine Parr. And I wrote a novel about her called The Taming of the Queen. And I've now adapted that to a film script, which I very much hope to make when we're all back to work again. Because, you know, again, she's a woman who is almost completely disregarded, and yet is the first writer in English, a theologian of significant importance, translator of the Bible, helped Cranmer with the Book of Common Prayer, and Henry's last wife. I mean, the one who survived him and went on to marry for love. An extraordinary story, and one that's hardly ever told.
Great. Well, it sounds like you have a lot to keep you busy. What with you have the nonfiction, you have the fiction, a film script when things get back to normal. Are there any other projects or anything you want to share with the audience about things that they can look forward to from you, or anything like that that you'd like to share?
I'm writing children's stories again, which I haven't done for years. I wrote a book called Princess Florizella when my daughter was a little girl, and I wanted a fairy story which would feature an active, brave, exciting, interesting girl who had adventures and was not the reward for an active, brave, interesting prince at the end of his adventures. So it was a set of books focused on a princess as the chief protagonist. And now I have grandsons. And so I have rewritten the book, and I'm now writing new versions of the story. It's called The Princess Rules, and it features not just Princess Florizella, but also her little brother and her best friend, Prince Bennett. And it's very much about how the rules of fairy tale land are the rules of conventional patriarchy, as it were, writ large, and how nonsensical they are in that they limit both girls and boys to develop their full potential. So that's a sort of the serious idea behind it. But I'm very pleased to say that we feature a mammoth who escapes from the Ice Age, and a sea serpent who eats princesses. And in the next edition, a very, very bad pirate called 5 Fathom Frida, and an incompetent fairy godmother. So I have some wonderful fairy tale, nonsensical characters to come.
Oh, that's wonderful. That must really keep things interesting to get to work on all kinds of different projects and different age groups. It seems like it would be a very rewarding, way to work and to have all these different things to focus on.
It literally suits different times of the day. So I do my research and my most serious and the work that needs the most concentration in the morning. And then in the afternoon, I kick back on the sofa and write fairy tales. I mean, what's not to like?
Oh, that's that sounds like a great day.
It is
So,
a great day.
so what else? What are your favorite things to do when you're not writing? Is it taking walks in the English countryside? Or, what do you do when you kind of need a break and you've been working so hard? You just want to do something to kind of, decompress or maybe think a little bit.
Well, I live in the countryside. I'm blessed in that way. So I love to walk. And although it is indeed dark and rainy, it's incredibly beautiful at this time of year. It's beautiful in a different way. So there's that. I'm increasingly keen as a gardener. So I've just been planting up tulips in pots, which are going to be wonderful in spring. They're such a sort of, I think planting spring flowers is such a promise to yourself that winter will indeed end. I have the company of my grandsons, which is always just such a joy and such fun. And, when things are okay, I like to go skiing and I like to travel. So I'm
Do
looking,
you?
yeah, very much.
Oh, that's great. And so that's interesting that you say you like to travel. I was wondering, do you get to take vacations where you're, in a place not to study and, to have your brain on? Or, even when you go on vacation, are you always kind of thinking about, like the history of that place? And are you always really immersing yourself wherever you go, even if it's not, a research trip?
Yeah, I mean, I I can't help being a historian, and that is very core to my nature. So when I do go somewhere on holiday, it's impossible for me to look down a street and not give it a mental date, and it's almost impossible for me to not to stop somebody and say, is this medieval? What sort of date is this? So I have my best holidays, I think, when I'm actually not necessarily doing directed research, but when I'm absorbing something about the place. I mean, I just think, and also the places that you go on holiday in Europe, of course, some of the nicest holiday venues are themselves extraordinarily interesting historic places. You can't really go to Greece without an awareness of the history.
Now we have an audience question, and it is, where is the first place that you will travel to when you can? If you could go anywhere in the world, where would it be?
Oh, I have a plan because
Oh,
I've been missing travel. I have a plan to ask all my friends if they know any European city really, really well, and if they would like to come with me for a weekend to the city that they know really, really well, and only stay for the weekend. I don't want them to stay for very long, so it's not a very generous invitation, but that I will then get an Airbnb in that city. So they will introduce me to the city and then they will go, and then I will live there for a week or maybe 2 weeks and take it in as if it was my hometown. I mean, really try and learn it, learn some of the language and go around. And I think my first choice is going to be probably Vienna.
oh, how nice. Gosh, I love the way you think. You have this idea, your book club where you got to read what you wanted to read. I mean, these are some great ideas you have. I definitely like the way you think.
Somebody said to me the other day, they said, wow, your life is perfect. And I said, yes, of course. I have been working on it for some time. It should be really lovely. Like, why would you make anything if in preference to making the really best life you could live?
Ah, well, you know what? I think that is a lovely note to end on. Philippa, it has been just so delightful to talk to you. Thank you again for making the time. Congratulations again on this book. I know everyone will love it. And I will turn it back over to Scott from Politics and Prose.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. I'd like to thank Philippa Gregory for joining us. Of course, the wonderful health journalist and bibliophile, Angela Hopt. And of course, all of the guests who have joined us, because your patronage is really what enables us to bring you events like this. And we cannot continue to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So please support Ms. Gregory and PNP by using the link in the chat to purchase Dark Tides, Tidelands, the whole Fair Mile series. Maybe pick up some of the works of Eric Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson, some of my favorite historians as well. And then check out our website for the most current and updated event listings, as we continue to have a great list of authors and others to choose from. We do hope to see you all again, and we thank all of you for joining us today. Again, I'm Scott Patrick from PMP, saying stay well read, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.